Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulence and change and consequential dynamics that it's hard to keep track. Today on Sustain What, I'm going to talk to two journalists who have founded a really neat enterprise on Substack called Public Domain. I love the name, and we can talk about that. And they're both experienced reporters looking mainly at the issue of American public resources, the landscape in this country, pretty not unique, but remarkable for nations around the world having so much public land, different kinds, parks, federal lands, you name it. And it adds up to millions and millions of acres. And right now, as is happening in so many arenas, the presidency, the second term of President Trump is kind of like a wrecking ball or a giant mega shovel or whatever you want to talk it, whatever metaphor you want to use. He's really going at not just the agencies, but capacities at agencies for managing these arenas responsibly, and putting forward executive orders and other policies that really could fundamentally change what we all take for granted in this country. So, greetings to Chris D'Angelo and Jimmy Tobias. Thanks for joining me, and let's just dive right in. And I thought I'd start with each of you, just sort of your thumbnail sketch of what brought you to this arena. You're both journalists. You could write about anything. There's a landscape of issues, as I said earlier, that goes from across the every possible arena. So, what is it about public lands that drives you, excites you, and then drives you crazy right at this moment, and has resulted in public domain? Maybe we'll start with Jimmy.
Well, I got my start in this world as a trail worker for the Forest Service, and prior to that for AmeriCorps. So after I graduated from college, I moved out to Montana and Idaho, and worked for 3 seasons on the some of the really large national forests out there, wilderness areas, and totally fell in love with public land. So from there, those were seasonal jobs, and in the winters I would freelance for the local paper, mostly covering public land wildlife issues. So that's really how I got my start. And being out in the wilderness areas like that for whole summers at a time was like life-changing and amazing. And so this issue is really close to my heart, and I've been covering it for ever since I was in like my mid-20s. So that's kind of how I got my start on public lands issues.
And Chris, same deal for you. What pulled you into this morass and
Yeah,
wonderful
so
place?
when I was a teenager, my one of my uncles took me on I think it was an 8-day, 9-day float in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and I'd never been to Montana before. Was sort of aware of public lands, but had never spent time sort of in the backcountry like that. And so that kind of led me to decide to go to school out in Missoula and get into fly fishing and hiking and all that stuff. And I kind of bounced around in journalism jobs. And when I ended up at HuffPost, I sort of carved out public lands as a beat. And I think just to kind of echo Jimmy, like I really care about these places, and it's been sort of part of my identity ever since the Bob Marshall trip. And Jimmy and I just did a long float on the Salmon River to recharge a little bit. That was a pretty interesting trip, sort of in the wake of some of what we've been covering. And so I just it's just been sort of something that I've really been focused on for, I'd say, almost 10 years now as part of my reporting. And then I ended up taking a buyout from HuffPost and was picking Jimmy's brain about the freelance world. And this thing sort of all came together pretty organically and naturally. So can talk more about that, but
Yeah, well, and I do want to talk about that because journalism is such a challenging arena right now, and Substack has become a haven for many. I was at the New York Times off and on for different capacities for 21 years, and then I started my Sustain What blog webcast when I was at Columbia 5 years ago, and migrated it here. It's not an easier place to make money in. It is for Paul Krugman and David Roberts. Uh, but so how is it working out? Do you what's your vision? Tell us about a little bit more about how this particular thing came together. There's other people who are part of it, and what the goal is with public domain.
Yeah, I think our goal was, I think Jimmy and I and Roque, who's our third co-founder, we just saw the writing on the wall about where some of this was going to head, and felt like, as newsrooms were sort of shrinking, the Interior Department as a beat was really taking a back seat. Get a lot of like kind of surface level reporting, but not deep document based stuff on appointees and nominees and kind of behind the curtain. So we just thought there was a real opening for us to try to build something that was really focused on public lands, wildlife, natural resources, and sort of where this administration was going to take things. And this is, this is a fight that's been going on for decades. It sort of went away for 8 years after, in 2017, Jason Chaffetz tried kind of a similar law piece of legislation to sell off land, and that the backlash was so fierce that most Republicans ran away from sale and transfer. But there's been, and we'll get into the details of this, I think, but there's sort of there are different strategies to try to make this all more palatable. Yeah, Jimmy, I'll let you talk a little bit about how this came together, which was really sort of like in a matter of 20, 30 minutes on the phone, we were brainstorming this.
Yeah, I mean, Chris and I have been working together for quite a while. When he was at HuffPost, we would team up on stories, and I think we both have been, pretty reporters of the major federal land management agencies, particularly the Interior Department, which controls hundreds of million acres of federal land, offshore drilling, administers the Endangered Species Act, runs the U.S. Geological Survey, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So, we there's so much to cover in this huge agency, and there's really not that many reporters who are doing it. And I think we saw this project as an opportunity to really come out swinging hard in an aggressive manner, covering the new Trump administration as beat reporters. And, we have partnered with a lot of other outlets too. We do a lot of co-publishing. We've done it with The Intercept, High Country News, The Guardian. So our idea is kind of to like use this as almost like a news desk, and obviously be able to publish here, but also be able to publish with the outlets we've worked. And yeah, we just think there's a lot of value in like consistent document-based beat coverage of an agency like this. And so, we rely on a lot of sources within the department, but we also do a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests and things like that to get the information that we're publishing. And, I think it's been, not to toot our own horn, but I think we've definitely brought some value to our readers. We've had some pretty significant scoops in the last 6 months, and we've broken some pretty big stories, including like, we were the first to name the main Doge operative at the Interior Department. We got a big leaked copy of their draft strategic plan laying out their vision for the next 5 years, and just been really beating the drum covering this agency. And yeah, that's sort of our vision. And I think we think Substack is, niche publication, hoping to, build a big enough subscriber base to sustain this project, and or potentially seek, grant funding to sustain us as we build that audience. But we've really, I think we've been gratified by the response from people. There's a lot of people who really care about these issues, as this most recent fight over the Republicans' attempt to sell off public lands shows.
Right. Yeah, and that's a key hot button issue right now. Um, we were just talking before we went on air about sort of the full landscape of when people think of public lands. There is a big Western bias to it. It's really a story of the West in many ways, and Washington, D.C. Um, and there was just a Reuters report that, let me see if I can show this. We can kind of talk through. So Reuters has just published a really cool package, eroding protections for public lands. Trump policies reshape the role of federally owned land against the tide of U.S. public opinion. Yeah, and that we could talk about that too. I think you guys have referenced this in your reporting as well, that people here care about these lands a lot. It's not just for extraction of physical resources. And there's a map in here I just want to get to that says so much about where where the hot button questions are. Map of public lands in the U.S. So here's Fish and Wildlife Service, blue, U.S. Forest Service, U.S. National Park Service, BLM, and Alaska, of course, is huge,
Yeah.
largely public. And whoops, oh, it's just going slow. And then here's the here we are in the West. You can see the West is really our, as Woody Guthrie sang, "This land is your land. This land is my land."
Totally.
How does that shape the dynamics of what you're reporting on?
I mean, what I think is so interesting is like in this sort of like time of fierce political divide on literally everything, public lands are sort of a uniting force. And I think we saw that in the response to Utah Senator Mike Lee's recent effort to sell off. At the beginning, it was like 3.2 million acres under sort of the guise of addressing affordable housing. But I mean, some of the fiercest criticism of that came from the very conservative circles. And I mean, we can dive into more of the details of that, but I just think every poll shows that protecting and conserving public lands is, wildly popular, and people don't want to see them either transferred to states or sold to private interests. The transfer to states sort of would inevitably lead to sale. And so, yeah, I mean, the landscape is really interesting for any effort to pawn them off or dispose of them, because, pick your state, support is kind of through the roof, be it, for monument protections or elevating conservation over extraction. There's a huge, outdoor recreation industry. I think it's 1.2 billion a year. So yeah, I mean, there's really the sort of anti-federal land movement is a small group.
Yeah.
They've been very strategic in kind of the messaging in recent years.
Yeah, and
Sorry.
they seem to not have a very bright future. I mean, if you saw this backlash to Mike Lee's proposal, a lot of these conservatives were on the younger side, probably live in places near national forests or things like that. And so it does seem to sort of be this like antiquated view, like a holdover from the 20th century that, I kind of view Mike Lee's, it was a cat his the failure of his attempt to sell off these lands was a pretty catastrophic loss for this effort, and just shows that it's probably not the future even of the Republican Party at some point.
Yeah, well, one can hope. The same thing with like science funding that historically has had bipartisan support in Congress. But and Mike, what happened with Mike Lee? Is there something you see in the Mike Lee reversal that indicates that Congress will sort of have a spine, even going forward, or is this There's something about the Trump pull on people that seems ultimately to dominate still, and I don't know whether this feels different. You really get a sense this is that we're seeing sort of the limits of Trumpian MAGA dynamics.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think even within Trump's own base, there's conflict over this. Like his son, Don Jr., is pretty pro public lands because he's a hunter himself, and
Right.
but you know, at the end of the day, four Republican senators came out against this publicly and said we're not going to vote for this bill if the land sell off. And there were, I think, like five Republican congressmen who said like this is a red line. You know, this is a red line for us. We're not crossing it. So, you know, his own party kind of sank this at the end of the day. It was the two senators from Montana and the two senators from Idaho, where public lands are very, very popular. So he ran up against his own party, really. So I think that was, you know, to answer your question, it was really that cohort within the Republican Party that made this impossible for him.
So that gets back to this Reuters map. In other words, the richness and the clear popularity in the Western states of this landscape of public ownership is pretty hard to overcome, even with the wrecking ball approach that Trump has pursued so far.
Yeah, I mean, you can see Idaho up there. It's like all that national forest, and
Right.
some like those are some of the biggest contiguous wildlands in the lower 48 right there. That's where Chris and I floated right through the kind of the heart of that
Wow.
green chunk. And it's really unbelievable landscape and has a ton of, you know, the culture up there is hunting, fishing, people going out there all the time. It's all free to access. You can stay for pretty much as long as you want. So
Yeah.
it's really unbelievable. It's an unbelievable treasure.
Yeah, I mean, I think also like if Senator Lee hadn't kind of gone to the extent that he went, if he didn't swing so big, I do think that there would have been, you know, there might have been a way to kind of hide this ball in the big beautiful budget bill. I think it kind of says something about, you know, he clearly saw an opportunity to move the needle in a big way and kind of went for it. And I think it backfired hugely. I mean, I think the other part of this that's really interesting to us and what we're kind of digging into now is like, there's a lot in that bill that undermines federal lands that didn't get much attention because attention was sort of focused on the land sale provision.
Mhm.
You know, fiat oil and gas leasing all over the place. There's budget discussions that would further, you know, gut funding for a lot of these federal land agencies, which leaves them sort of unable to properly manage these lands, which then, you know, helps the argument for, you know, it makes it easier to argue that these agencies are sort of mismanaging lands and we should do something about that. So there's a lot of other stuff going on here that, you know, I think kind of got lost while the focus was on Mike Lee. And I will say that, you know, there was a pretty clear effort to make Mike Lee out to be this sort of lone actor in all this. But as Jimmy mentioned, there were only a handful of Republicans that said, you know, came out and publicly said they're against this. The Interior Department under Trump has a similar proposal to sell off up to 400,000 acres for public or for affordable housing. So, you know, this thing isn't gone by any means.
Right. And what's your like you talked about that sort of group community distributed model for reporting. What should everyone be looking at right now?
I think we're seeing like two major trends at the Interior Department. One is related to Doge, where there's been this effort to, you know, push out and purge all these civil servants. And I think the end game there is sort of to like restock the bureaucracy with civil servants more in Trump's image. You know, you might have seen there was a memo from the Office of Personnel Management where they said, oh, when you start hiring new people back, there's going to be these like essay questions about how these applicants will promote the president's priorities and things like that. So I think we see this like effort to basically remake the bureaucracy in the Trump administration's image. And then on the other hand, there's really this effort by these appointees to dismantle like many of the basically the environmental legal edifice from the 20th century. So like weaken these landmark laws like the Endangered Species Act, the Wilderness Act, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, and definitely the National Environmental Policy Act. So just all these major central environmental laws from the kind of the heyday of the conservation movement are under really intense assault right now by this administration. So those are kind of the two things: the dismantling of the bureaucracy and the dismantling of these crucial environmental laws. And we've covered a lot of instances of that since we got going earlier this year.
I just want to add that I think that this will sort of end up playing out in a lot of small fights at the local level, because there'll be so much pressure to, put out oil and gas leases or get mines built. I mean, I think that this is going to kind of take a more local focus, just now that we're not talking about 3.2 million acres being on the national chopping block.
Right. What's your take on some of his executive orders, like Making America Beautiful Again Commission and stuff? How much heft is there in what he's trying to do this way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's unclear to me exactly what they're trying to accomplish with this commission, except like give some of their allies things to do.
Yeah.
It's almost like, it reads to me almost like kind of like a lip service to this, to conservation, as they, strip, break down the bureaucracy, get rid of all these conservation protections. So I don't know. This one you pulled up is a very new one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I'm reflecting on when Ryan Zinke was the Interior Secretary during Trump's first term. I feel like we're seeing sort of a similar thing play out with Doug Burgum, which is the first year is all kind of energy dominance, and then there will be a point where there's some sort of shift back towards conservation at some level, and under Zinke that included migration corridors and winter range. I think there will kind of come a time where they need some sort of win on conservation. Last go around, it was the Great American Outdoors Act, which dealt with the National Park Service maintenance backlog.
Yeah.
But Trump kind of turned around and undermined that in certain ways his first term. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a great sense of, if I recall, I read this when it came out. I think part of it is sort of phrased as returning accountability to federal agencies, which, if you're gutting the National Park Service budget by 30%, I don't know how it gets you closer to accountability or better management, or
No, it seems contradictory for sure, and that's been the same thing at a number of other agencies, where even the goals of Trump are just not supported by the sort of the depopulation and capacity destruction of the same agencies where he claims he wants work to be done. He also has this magical capacity to distract the media on issues like this. He hasn't directly pushed this lately, but the whole business with Mount Rushmore, like the New York Times, I was so pissed at the New York Times, my former employer, for spending so much time saying, what would Rushmore look like with Trump's head on it? And like the fourth paragraph was, oh, by the way, the Interior Department, here's the 2 reasons why this will never happen.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we get fixated on this kind of stuff, where some of the things you're talking about are pretty subtle in the background.
Yeah, I remember during the first term, we published a story during Trump 1.0 from like a leaked conversation that one of his Interior Department people had with a bunch of oil and gas executives. And this appointee was talking about how they were going to open up the Atlantic to offshore drilling. And during this conversation, which was a private conversation, said like, but the president is so good at like, drawing media attention away from so we can like pursue these policies in peace, you know. And so he really is so effective at kind of distracting people. And I think that's one of the things that, we feel like what we're doing is, valuable because we're really focused on these specific, sometimes in the weeds, policies and changes and people at these agencies. And we're trying not to be distracted by, the other things that he says that are so easy to focus on.
Is there, in thinking about what you're trying to do, you talk about grants and like and partnerships. Going forward a year or two from now, what would your ideal landscape look like? When I click on publicdomain.media, what would I find if your dreams come true?
It's a great question. I think more reporters, possibly,
Yeah.
maybe a podcast, better art, and just like more capacity to, there's so many stories we kind of have to pass up or just don't have time to get around to, or they're on our list, but we haven't gotten there yet because there's just so much going on, and so it'd be really nice to like beef up the newsroom and have more of those partnerships, really be like a go-to source for these issues, and providing a lot of, providing articles that other people are republishing, things like that. Chris, what's your answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with all that. I think our main goal is to just build a subscriber base. We know that there are millions of people out there that care about this in one form or another, be it you like to go out on public lands to look at birds or just, have a picnic, or whether you ride an ATV or hunt elk, fish for trout. Right. I mean, we know that there's so much interest in this. Mike Lee proved it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've kind of talked a lot about and have at times, I think, struggled with is not getting pulled into the kind of day-to-day stuff, but staying focused on really, pulling back the curtain on some of the players that are in, high power positions within these agencies, but sort of behind that curtain. I mean, there's so many people that are very influential that their name is never out there. They sort of get appointed and confirmed, and then they sort of disappear. And so much of, as we talked about when we were prepping for this, I mean, it's a lot of what we're seeing does sort of dovetail with Project 2025. And we've been looking into some of that. I think it's worth mentioning that the Interior Department chapter of that playbook was written by William Perry Penley, who has spent a career sort of advocating against federal lands and was Trump's acting director of the Bureau of Land Management during his first term. But when it came to writing the energy section of that, he gave the pen to Kathleen Sagama, who was, she's the head of the Oil and Gas Trade Association. What is it?
Western Energy Alliance.
Energy Alliance. And she was the nominee for BLM, but was pulled or stepped aside after some critical comments against January 6th surfaced, which was not the way I saw that nomination fizzling, but
yeah, really. There's some good questions that are coming in, but I just want to add one more before I get to them. A big chunk of what you were talking about is records, and I'm curious to know how worried you are about slowness or incompleteness or FOIA requests under Trump 1 and Trump 2. Is this particularly problematic? Do you need to have a legal branch of what you're trying to do? Some help from folks like that.
We do work with a team of attorneys based out of Chicago who represent us pro bono, and I've filed a lot of lawsuits against the Interior Department. Actually, our first public domain lawsuit is in the works now. But it's really, I would say that I haven't noticed a major difference yet between the Freedom of Information Act office under Trump to versus even Biden. Like, all of these offices are way under resourced, really
Right.
slow. They have huge backlogs. And so no matter really who's in charge, you end up waiting months and months in many cases to get records back, and basically have to sue if you're trying to get records in any kind of timely manner. So I wouldn't say I've seen a huge difference yet with this administration, at least for the Interior Department. I can't really speak to other agencies and what's happened there. For the Interior Department, I haven't noticed a huge difference. But bottom line is, like, we're going to have to sue for records. And, we're going over, initially at least, our strategy is sort of to go after pretty basic records like the calendars of these political appointees to see who they're meeting with, certain, their emails on certain topics, things like that. Some of those things should just be easily available, but they're not. So, and we just got a bunch of financial disclosures for people after waiting a couple of months. So it's definitely it can be a slow process, but yeah, I in all honesty, I wouldn't say I've seen a huge difference between Trump and Biden on FOIA.
Yeah. And
I mean,
how important are whistleblowers? Okay, actually,
oh no,
good.
I was just going to say, I mean, I do sort of wonder if we're going to see an impact on FOIA responses, once we're still pretty early into this. I mean, there was this very interesting Project 2025 affiliated, well, it was Project 2025. It was basically a training video for how would-be appointees could skirt FOIA. And, basically if you have something to talk about, pick up the phone kind of guidance,
Right.
which I don't think is unique to Trump in any real way. But, I do wonder if we're going to see more of this work being taken offline once, people have settled in.
Yeah, and hopefully, I assume you're open. You have an open. You're openly embracing whistleblower.
Yeah, we had this fun strategy right at the beginning where we FOIA'd for all the email addresses of like all the civil servants in the Interior Department, and we sent all these mass emails out to them being like, we're beat reporters, like, feel free, we've been covering this agency for years, feel free to get in touch. And we got so many responses. It was pretty unbelievable, to the point where the Interior Department has now blocked, I think, my email address because I can't get through anymore. But whistleblowers were essential, and provided us with many, like those first two stories on the right side of the page there were from whistleblower sources. And so many, especially because like the FOIAs hadn't started yet. So a lot of our early stories were from people within the agencies, and they were really brave and courageous and provided us a lot of really good early information that we wouldn't have been able to get otherwise.
That's great. So let's get to some questions. Brigitte Racine on LinkedIn, first of all, says, thanks for hosting Chris and Jimmy. Just subscribed. Public lands are a national treasure. But then she had a question here. Let me get to it. She says, I'm pretty worried about the two things you just mentioned, the dismantling of the bureaucracy and specific legal frameworks. Has there been a similar moment in recent memory where public lands were in danger that we can learn from? What can the normal citizen do other than the usual call and email campaigns? So there are really two questions there. Has there been a previous moment when things were kind of like this? And what can the average person do?
I mean, in 2017, Utah Representative Jason Chaffetz floated a similar proposal to what Mike Lee did. It was a little different, but I think it was 2 or 3 million acres, and the the backlash was so intense that like the whole Trump administration basically ran away from this. I mean, they got flooded with phone calls, obviously. That's more on the kind of legislative side. I mean, I think what we're seeing now from Trump's White House is not that different than the first go around, in terms of prioritizing extraction, putting conservation, on the sidelines, if in the discussion at all. I mean, Interior Secretary Doug Burgum he talks about America's public lands as a balance sheet and assets that we're getting a crummy return on, and that's sort of how he sees them. The word conservation is largely not in his vocabulary at the moment.
Right.
So I think like I said, I think a lot of like where the rubber will meet the road is sort of at the local project level, and I think there's a whole bunch of different ways to get involved in that. The extent to which kind of public comment generally will be taken into account on some of this stuff, I don't. I have a hard time seeing, federal agency giving much weight to that, and I don't think that's like unique to.
So just being one of those thousands of comments on the proposed rulemaking is probably not the best approach to your time.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
I think it can help in court cases and things. A lot of what like holds these projects up, of course, are lawsuits and people using these conservation laws to protect landscapes, and they're going after those laws themselves. I think, one of the things that always stands out to me is something like the Endangered Species Act, which I'm really interested in. It has enormous public support. It's very, very popular, but there's so many ways that this administration is trying to kind of weaken it, in some ways very, badly damage it, through rulemakings and things like that. And I always get the sense that people aren't super tuned in to what's happening with a law like the Endangered Species Act. When it comes to like selling off public lands, everyone is up in arms. But when it comes to like deeply damaging this beloved law, there's not as much public pushback. And so I think people just like, acquainting themselves with laws like this more and following what's happening. And, of course, speaking out helps, but just getting involved in sort of a specific issue, whether it's the Endangered Species Act or NEPA or FLIPMA, like understanding what these laws are and being able to like make interventions when they can, whether, in whatever form fits their life. But yeah, there's just a lot going on, and I get the sense that a lot of it is happening under the radar, and that's what we're trying to combat. But I think readers as well, just like acquainting themselves and is a good first place to start.
So why a particular law matters to you in your context?
Yeah.
There's another question here from Michael Carroll on YouTube. Can you ask Chris and Jimmy what role they see the courts playing in these fights? Well, you've mentioned your interactions with lawyers just in terms of FOIA, et cetera, but what can happen in that realm? And maybe we talk about the Supreme Court as well.
I think a lot of the changes that the Trump administration are making will get fought out in court. And, of course, it's hard to say how any one of those fights will play out. But that's one of the big reasons why, when Mike Lee's proposal went down in the Big Beautiful Bill, there were several other really potentially damaging provisions that were put forward in the Big Beautiful Bill that ended up getting stripped out of it. That really would have like been permanent damaging proposals on public lands and wildlife issues. And the fact that they didn't get through the legislative process and are now, the Trump administration is going to have to pursue them in the administrative realm means there's way more opportunity for people to fight them in court. So I think courts are going to be a major kind of center of conflict over this issue, as they so often are. That's just how it always is.
there was language in there, wasn't it related to the boundary waters where
Yeah.
it would basically no one could sue to block it. It would eliminate the ability for people to sue against greenlighting those mineral leases or restoring them. But the only party that would have been able to sue would have been the companies if the agencies didn't follow through with allowing for the mine. So sort of a one-way street in the legal realm, which I think we've seen that pop up in other places too. I would also just mention that like Trump's legal record during his first term was less than stellar. So especially on environmental stuff.
Yeah, there's some interesting areas where the different issues intersect in ways that are, well, I guess lead to trade-off questions. One is mining, and even if you wanted to have expanded renewable energy, there's got to be, and if you had some interest in it coming from the United States, the key materials as opposed to um, overseas, you need to have streamlining. You need to have some different approach to public lands assets. Is there something that? How do you see that playing out in terms of sort of the trade-offs? Or do you talk much to your colleagues covering renewable energy? This is playing out right now in several
Yeah.
different ways.
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of new frontier for public lands. And I think there's even with the environmental movement, there's different camps and a lot of conflict over the vision for public lands. As you know, I covered the solar development in Nevada and some of the big
Yeah,
transmission
that's
lines
a
that were
classic example, right?
that were proposed out there. And there's green groups out there that really don't like how the Biden administration was handling those proposals and thought it was way too um, loosey goosey. Not nearly enough analysis of where a proper place to put these transmission lines and solar panels. They felt they didn't do a good job on it, and they were preparing and may still sue over some of the proposals that made it through during the Biden administration. And others feel very differently. So I think it's hard to like make a sweeping assessment, and it's really to me it's like you have to look at these projects on a case by case basis. In the example Chris mentioned, there's this foreign mining giant that wants to build a copper mine right at the edge of the Boundary Waters Wilderness, which is one of the most famous, iconic wilderness areas in the country, pristine waters. And they want to build this copper mine in the watershed that feeds this wilderness lake complex. And there's been a lot of conflict over it. The Biden administration rejected the mining permits. The Trump administration is trying to revive them. It's gone back and forth for years. So we'll see how it plays out. But, whether the edge of one of America's most famous wilderness areas is the appropriate place for a copper mine, that's up to people to decide for themselves. But, obviously that mine is using green energy as sort of a justification for its project. A lot of conservationists aren't buying that. Others, I think that mine does have support, but more from like labor and business interests in Minnesota. But yeah, each of these projects, obviously solar takes up a lot of land. And so where it's placed is a really important question. And I think it's something that the country is still figuring out. People are still figuring out. The Interior Department is still figuring out. I don't think the Trump administration is too favorable to solar, but not because they're worried about the landscapes. I think they have other motivations for their efforts to kind of push back on green energy.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Here's another
that was a
question.
long question. Yeah.
No. It's important. And one thing that you've revealed, again, getting back to what the average person can do, is once again, it's about your landscape, your regional context, and voters in Minnesota or in another state where these issues are playing out, understanding that they have a role to play, at least at that level. I think that's where you get more uh, buy-in from governors and even other uh, elected officials at the local level. Leanne Wilberg, Weiberg, sorry, on YouTube. I'm with DC Science Writers Association. What specifically can science writers and public information officers do to help out? Yeah, because I think DC Science Writers includes people who are public information, press release kind of people as well as journalists. And how do you, maybe one part of that is, how do you expand your network?
Yeah, I think, again, the first thing that popped into my head is like the major science agency at the Interior Department is the U.S. Geological Survey, and it gets such little coverage. I mean, there is sometimes coverage of it, but it's a big and influential scientific agency that people aren't paying too much attention to. So I think the first thing I would say, if you're a science writer, is that'd be a great beat, like covering the U.S. Geological Survey and what's happening there right now. But they do a ton of earth science, things like that. And for public information officers, I'd say, let us talk to sources without going through you first. That's the thing that's changed a lot. Yeah, it's the thing that's changed a lot. I think, everyone says like you used to be able to go to like a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist or a, national park superintendent and just call them up on their office phone and have a long chat with them. And now like they have to put you in touch with the public information officer, and there's this extra level that I think kind of chills free flowing discussion. And so it'd be nice. I don't know what public information officers can do about that, but it'd be nice to be able to access sources without going through that process.
That was true under Obama at EPA.
Yeah,
this transcends current politics.
Yeah. And we've run into, where we've reached out for very specific questions, be it about, someone's new appointment to the agency or a potential conflict of interest, ethical violation, where there seems to be a growing trend where it's just basically like, you're terrible for asking this question. We've gotten like so much of that in the last few weeks.
Oh God. Yeah. I've seen that from another, well, what's her name? Yeah. Levitt, the White House.
Yeah.
Spoke press. She's always saying that. How dare you ask that question?
Right.
Yeah.
Un-American.
Yeah.
Oy. It's kind of surreal. I maybe I'll save it for a couple minutes from now. There's just a comment that came in from Kim on Twitter. Conservation is nonpartisan. I think that's where you build your audience. I think that's where the strength of the pushback to some of the more destructive things on the agenda comes from that. There's a big history of that. Even as you said, one of Trump's sons who likes to pose with the heads of the animals he's killed. Hunters and anglers are a big part of what makes our preserves our environment. Ducks Unlimited up here in Maine, where I am, certainly in down East Maine, our relationship to the environment is largely through direct experience.
We have followers that we know of, subscribers who are huge Trump supporters, but when it comes to the issue of public lands and where they saw Mike Lee in the White House trying to take this thing, they signed up, and this is like a very clear line in the sand that they aren't on board with. And I think there's a lot more of that than people might realize. I just go back to like, this really does strike me as one of the few issues where both sides of the aisle are expressing the same thing. And it's kind of, it's really refreshing, honestly, to see.
That's good. Over on LinkedIn, a user talks about PFAS, the EPA PFAS contamination of drinking water is being contested in the American Water Association et al. The case was held in abeyance, and EPA decided to move ahead. Some modifications have been made to the 2024 EPA PFAS rule. The arguments being made to challenge the rule is that it did not follow APA. It's unduly burdensome. There was some other PFAS news the last few days. Now, I know you probably don't stretch into this arena as much unless it's related to the waters of the United States, WOTUS, But any thoughts on this question or comment?
Yeah, we don't, I don't cover EPA too much,
Yeah,
but the question of following the APA and duly burdensome, I mean, that's like a classic argument that people make on both sides of the aisle against rules they don't like. Um, and it's interesting to me because there's definitely a movement out there to kind of get rid of some of these procedural laws and regulations. Um, but both sides seem to really like them when it comes to going to court. So we'll see. But yeah, I can't speak too much to that. I don't know if you've covered it much, Chris, but not
Yeah,
recently,
I
at least I haven't.
haven't. Um, I know that here in Maine, that's been a huge fight, but it's not something I've dug into yet.
yeah, yeah. You have to be effective in journalism. You really have to put on blinders to a certain extent. This is where I am. I mean,
Right.
what I do here is across the board. But not everyone. I'm just spanning the whole sustainability question. But if we all did that, nothing would get done. We need specialists and deep divers and generalists, and it's great. That's one of the reasons I like what you're doing and the capacity through Substack to find you, and then to see if I can find some wider reverberations around that. I wanted to get back, close out with a couple more things. One of which is just asking you a little bit more about what's next on your reporting agenda, or what people can help you with. But I also want to kind of ask you about how hard it is or not to focus on agencies where so much has been inverted. Back on Earth Day, the EPA happily announced their biggest deregulatory action in U.S. history. You have an agency that's technically responsible for protecting the environment that's going in the opposite direction. It brought to mind to me the novel and the movie Fahrenheit 451, where the fire department are people who go around burning books and burning the houses of people with books. It just seems surreal. Do you have your own strategy for coping with diving into another round of this kind of situation? Maybe Jimmy first, and
Yeah, I mean, it is surreal. I think it's always kind of shocking what's going on behind the scenes. Like we just published a story about a guy who had worked as an offshore lobbyist for the offshore industry for years, and then he just got the offshore industry regulatory agency at the Interior Department. It's called the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And, we got a bunch of his emails and his calendar entries. And lo and behold, he's working on the exact same issues now that he's in government that he was working on as a lobbyist, which strikes me as like a major conflict of interest. And several ethics experts we talked to were concerned about this pattern. But, he seems to be doing this with complete impunity. So it is shocking. And to your question of what we're working on things like this. Like we just got a wish list that the oil industry sent the Trump administration of all the policies they want. So we're working on a story about this wish list, and we're finding they're getting exactly what they want, as you would expect. I think we're also interested longer term in digging into some of the Interior Secretary's business interests, digging into sort of the continued impacts of Doge, following closely these attacks on various environmental laws, and continuing just to dig into people like this guy. His name's Matt Giaccona, just like identifying the political appointees and figuring out exactly what they're doing, and whose backs they're scratching. So that's sort of where I think we're going to be going. But not too much happens in August. And I think to cope with this, well, we did just go on a really nice river trip, so that always helps.
Kind of a funny little aside on the river trip. We show up. It's a permitted river, so you have to check in with a ranger to get on the river. So we're up at like 7:30. We're waiting around, and it's 11 a.m. and there's no ranger. So we put in on a river that we got a permit for, never talking to a ranger. The first day we float right next to a forest fire on the bank of the river.
Mm.
And we talked to other floaters who they hadn't seen a ranger the day before. There was no toilet paper in the bathrooms.
No sign about the fire, you know.
I've been reflecting on how wild it is to go through the process of getting a permit, show up when there's a forest fire downstream, and have no one there to tell you where should you camp, where shouldn't you camp. I think that's kind of like, that was a pretty striking example of where I think, maybe the person was sick or his car broke down or something, I don't know, but of where this situation facing federal agencies really does impact you on a personal level and potentially on a safety level.
Yeah. Well, hopefully the reporting you're doing can help direct people toward, including elected officials, toward better outcomes in the months to come. And I hope everyone has a chance to experience those public lands. Maine we're the 43rd state down the list in terms of public land, meaning federal land.
It's funny.
We have masses of publicly accessible private land in Maine. It's wonderful.
It's funny you bring that up, because I was listening to Interior Secretary Doug Burgum, I think a month or so ago, and he was talking about how unbalanced it is from Western states to Eastern states. And his argument was basically like, none of the 13 original colony states have more than, I think he said 2% federal land, which isn't true. I mean, it's not accurate to begin with, but he said, I don't hear any of those states asking for more public land. And I thought to myself, really? I mean, I think there's a lot of people out here who would love, I mean, there's a reason that Maine has so much, the land trust network has become so huge here. It's because we don't have it.
Right. And luckily there is that activism around and money put into setting aside lands for public use, even when there isn't a historical aspect of it. Oh, there's a quick question about the fire. Caregivers for Medicaid says it was a live burning fire that you passed.
It was. We can send you a video clip.
Yeah, we have videos of it burning right on shore as we went by, and our reserved campsite that night was supposed to be right across from it, and we kind of as a group pulled in and we're like, well, should we move? Should we keep going? Should we stay here? It doesn't look like it's a super aggressive fire. And we ended up going downstream a couple miles and woke up in the morning, and the inversion had brought all the smoke in. The whole ridge was in flames. It was actually really cool to see, because it was burning in a perfect line right across the hillside, real slow on the ground. So I don't, we never really felt like we were in danger, but would have been nice to know from someone.
Well, I really appreciate your taking the time to come on Sustain What for the past hour to talk about these really crucial issues. Public lands are a big part of the identity of the United States. And to a certain extent, there's signs that this legacy and asset will survive the Trump regime. But that won't happen without a lot of work, a lot of great journalism. And publicdomain.media is a great starting place. I hope at least some of the people who are watching will subscribe and share this conversation. As soon as we're done, it'll be archived on whatever you're watching on. And again, I appreciate what you're doing. Good luck, and maybe we can come back on sometime when you have some breaking news to propagate.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Andy. Great chatting with you.
Sure, and just hold on one second. This is Sustain What, where we try to kind of pursue progress amid complexity and consequence through conversation. Hold on.